Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members Teresa and Linda, are master gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
Hi, and welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. I'm Tim Kennelty.
And I'm Jean Thomas. We have Bob Bifus with us today, and the topic of our conversation is ginseng. Now, I'll admit I thought this was a nice, easy project, since Bob is famously, in our area, the ginseng guy. Then I started researching. I started with looking up Bob's career and how he became the ginseng guy. Bob has his master's degree from Cornell on raising ginseng and never looked back. Many of you are familiar with Bob's weekly advice column in most area local papers. How many do you contribute to, Bob?
I think there's about 6 or 7 different newspapers that I send it out to. Today, those newspapers are all owned by 1 or 2 companies, so I think there's maybe 2 or 3 major publishers that I'm sending it to, but it appears in at least 6 or 7 local newspapers.
Yeah, I've seen it at least that many. I'm going to have to start counting because I think there's more.
And then, of course, I read the column and I record that on WRIP for every Friday and Saturday morning. They run that spot over and over again. And it's basically, I'm just reading my newspaper column. So it's on the radio every week on Friday and Saturday morning at about 6:30 in the morning.
No one escapes Bifus.
You're stuck with me.
Yeah.
So, Bob, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your career. We ask everybody this to kind of see what they're interested in. We're not looking for a list of credentials, but tell us about what you have been interested in and what your career has been.
I've had a great career at Cornell Cooperative Extension. 31 years I worked here and pretty much started at the bottom as a part-time summer assistant, made myself indispensable, became an agent. Started out in horticulture mostly and then became interested in natural resources about when I went back for my master's degree, which they were kind enough to pay for. And that's when I became interested in natural resources in general, but ginseng in particular. And so I pretty much spent the last, I would say, 15, 18 years of my career with Cooperative Extension working on agroforestry and most specifically working on ginseng. And I won't even begin to try to hit, the highlights, but if I had to pick one event that really pushed me, it was the Ginseng Y2K conference, which was an international conference that we hosted here in Greene County in the year 2000, which literally put Greene County on the map and sort of helped to get me launched in my ginseng career. And that was really the highlight. From that came this building that we're sitting in now. That was the start of that. We made money on the conference, and it was wildly successful and attracted some national attention. And we parlayed it into building this agroforestry resource center, which we're sitting in right now. So if we're not for ginseng, we wouldn't be sitting in this beautiful building today.
Okay, now explain to me again, why is ginseng so fascinating to you?
Well, ginseng is kind of the poster child of rare and endangered plants. I asked this to the leading ginseng researchers like Jim McGraw, and they said, well, ginseng is special because of its history and because of its status, being a threatened and endangered plant, yet it's something that's grown. So ginseng itself is a fascinating plant. Of all the woodland plants, probably the most fascinating. And I have personal history with it, which I don't want to go into because it'll take forever. But I'm absolutely convinced that taking ginseng is what allowed me to get through graduate school. Hadn't been to college in 13 years, and I went back to Cornell, and I was absolutely petrified that I was going to flunk out and embarrass myself, and started taking ginseng then on a regular basis, and I think it changed my life. So when it came time to declare my major, which was after one semester at Cornell, I asked my professor if I could work on ginseng, and he said yes, and that's how it all began.
So you have this history with ginseng, which is very cool, but there's also a history of the plant itself. It was started as a novelty crop, right? And even Daniel Boone was a ginseng entrepreneur. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. It was never really a novelty crop. It was actually North America's first major export to the rest of the world, particularly China. But basically, through Europe to China, but going back to the 1700s, 1715 is when ginseng was actually first exported from North America. So there's a long, long tradition. There's stories that George Washington borrowed money to finance the American Revolution from people who dealt in ginseng.
Yeah.
So the history goes way even beyond Daniel Boone. But the Daniel Boone story is that he had a shipment of 40 tons of ginseng on a barge on the Ohio River, which somehow overturned, and they lost that entire crop. But the story goes that within 3 months he was able to gather another 40 tons of ginseng and export that. So yeah, Daniel, he's definitely got some history with ginseng.
I think that's how he afforded to get all those raccoon skin caps, right?
I heard of a language thing about tons, that ton, T-U-N, is what they lost, not 2,000 pounds a piece, but a ton is a barrel.
That has been hotly debated.
Yeah.
That's really, I've heard both sides of it too. And the latest version I heard is from a historian who I just wrote a wonderful book about ginseng diggers and the history of ginseng digging in Appalachia. And Luc Manger is his name. And he basically says, the 30 tons being 2,000 pounds per barrel, he said, is not unreasonable. So I assumed also that 30 tons, because they did refer to a barrel as a ton, and ginseng was often shipped in barrels. But according to Luke, very possible that it was actually 30 2,000-pound tons that were on the barge.
Controversy, I love it.
Still, historical controversy.
I love it. Okay, so it's an old established crop in the U.S., but now there's a difference between American and Asian ginseng. Why were the Chinese so excited about the American ginseng when they already had their own at home?
Asian ginseng is a different species than American ginseng, and they're different medicines. They're clearly different medicines, but 1,000 years ago, Asian ginseng had become very, very scarce and rare, virtually extinct in most of Asia. And so when wild American ginseng was discovered, and the plants look virtually identical. If I had two of them growing side, you couldn't tell them apart. And so when this plant became available, the Chinese welcomed it, but they immediately determined that it was a different medicine. It was not the same. It was equally good. If anything, it was better than Asian ginseng, but it was a different medicine. But it's been part of their traditional medicine ever since 1700s. I mean, ginseng itself is about 2,000-year history in China, but American ginseng from, let's say, 1715 onward has been a really important part of their medicine, but it is a different medicine.
So I know that I couldn't just go back in my backyard and plant ginseng. It needs specialized conditions. But you have pioneered some methods called forest farming and wild simulated methods to grow ginseng. Tell us about that.
Yeah, my efforts in developing wild simulated ginseng as a crop has to do with the fact that the wild ginseng commands so much of a higher price than cultivated ginseng. Cultivated ginseng grown under artificial shade cloth, there's thousands of acres of that are being produced in North America. Well, the price for that particular type of ginseng, which is grown for 3, maybe 4 years under shade cloth, treated with all sorts of chemicals, the price of that ginseng right now is about $15 a pound, whereas the price of woodland ginseng runs anywhere from $800 to $2,000 a pound. So we're talking a significant, of course, the yields are much, much lower. However, and the growing season is much, much lower. It takes about 10 years to grow a crop in the woods, whereas, again, 3 years for the artificially shaded ginseng. But the value of it is just so much more. But the real bonus in wild simulated ginseng is that it protects the forest resource. It is something that keeps the trees. There's no pesticides applied. There's no tillage. There's no chemicals. It basically, you do timber stand improvement, which is an important forestry management topic, basically to make the site suitable for ginseng. So it really does tend to keep land sequestered in a way that is very, very beneficial for all the environments of the forest. So growing wild simulated ginseng is definitely a win-win situation for the forest and for the landowner if he's got a suitable spot. Not all land is suitable.
Does it directly benefit the trees around it when it grows in some chemical way or something like that?
That's a very good question. I think the more we learn about the interactions between forest communities, I think the more we learn that there are some roles that are being played and there is some communication that's going on between trees and herbaceous plants. And I think the more we study, the more we're finding that, yes, that is indeed the case. I can't specifically cite any research to back that up, but my gut feeling is that the more we learn, the more we will discover that there are communities in the forest, and we need to recognize that.
Okay, so we're encouraging forest farming. I know across the road from the ACRA office, I think we have test plots and things going on over there with a lot of forest farming. How big is the industry, in quotes, of growing American ginseng? Both the shade cloth kind of stuff and the naturalized.
Well, the shade cloth, obviously, 95% of the ginseng that is grown in North America is grown under shade cloth. Ontario actually produces the most. They harvest about 6 to 10 million pounds of ginseng a year. Wisconsin harvests about 3 to 4 million pounds of ginseng per year. We have no figures on how much ginseng is actually being grown in the forest. We do have data on how much so-called wild ginseng is being exported each year. That's very carefully tracked, and that amounts to about 50 or 60,000 pounds a year. I suspect that most of that figure is actually being grown by someone in some small manner, and it's not just people are going out and finding wild ginseng. So I think that people have been growing ginseng in the woods for hundreds of years, but people won't admit that because they won't get paid the price that wild ginseng commands. So there's no incentive for people to say that, yeah, that ginseng is actually, I grew it in the woods, because they're going to get paid the price of wild ginseng, which, as I said, is substantially higher than cultivated ginseng.
I know there's some really specific cultivation methods. We've looked at some of your published works, and there's a lot of really specific information for anyone interested in growing some ginseng for market. I was amazed by the really very detailed requirement list. Frankly, it kind of scared me a little bit in terms of thinking about doing this in my own backyard. So what's the biggest challenge for an individual interested in starting a patch of their own ginseng?
Okay, well, I should point out that I basically modeled a lot of my data on the ecological conditions in which wild ginseng grows under. And any site that harbored wild ginseng or had the particular characteristics where wild ginseng should grow, even though it may have been extirpated from that particular site, obviously that's the best site to go. But I've since changed my attitude a little bit on this, and I would now encourage anyone who has any forested land to give it a try. And I think that people that go into this thinking that they're going to make $1 million in 10 years or get rich, they're never going to make out. But if you're interested in growing it for your own personal use, perhaps your family, or for your own health, by all means, I would encourage you, because it can be grown. I've seen it grown beautifully in someone's shady perennial garden. So, I mean, it's daunting to grow to make any money on it, like many agricultural crops. But the average Joe or the average Jane, to grow it, I think it's certainly feasible that it can be done, and it should be done, because it's good medicine.
Okay. Doesn't Cooperative Extension have classes and handouts and instructions on growing ginseng for the general public?
Yes, actually, many states have much more sophisticated publications that we have in New York here in Cornell. But I did write a publication called Practical Guide to Growing Ginseng, which is available for free download through the Cornell Commons. And yes, we do have many fact sheets and things like that I've written over the years, but so do many other states too, because the culture is a little bit different in different parts of the country. The conditions here are a little different than in Appalachia and different here than it is in Maine, for example. But yeah, there is pretty good information out there, and there's a lot of bad information out there too. The internet, YouTube video, I did a couple of YouTube videos for Virginia Tech, which I think are really quite good, about growing ginseng or where is ginseng found. And if people are interested, I usually send them a list of resources, which include links to the videos and links to my bulletin and things like that. So the information is out there.
What about deer and rabbits? I mean, are there herbivores that are eating ginseng?
Yeah.
Is that something you have to worry about?
Sadly, white-tailed deer are probably the greatest threat to ginseng's existence. Professor McGraw, who's the leading ginseng researcher, he states that if ginseng goes extinct within the next 100 years, it'll be primarily due to predation by deer.
I just had a terrible thought.
Uh-oh.
If the ginseng got you through graduate school, imagine what it's doing for the deer.
I like to make that comment about the reason that southeastern Ohio has such crappy ginseng and such big deer is because the deer eat the ginseng. And that's why southeastern Ohio is famous for its giant bucks. But it's also famous for its little tiny ginseng roots.
I was just thinking, how many crops do I have in me if it takes 10 years? At one, a half, I don't know.
Well, you never know till you try.
Besides the deer, though, there are people who steal it. They're ginseng rustlers, right? It's so crazy.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting perspective because, okay, if you're growing ginseng, on your property, you planted the seeds, and someone comes and takes it, that's not poaching, that's theft. That could be a felony. Very easily could be a felony because ginseng's so valuable. However, if someone wanders onto your land and there's wild ginseng growing there, and they take the wild ginseng, now that's poaching. So poaching specifically refers to the illegal harvest of a natural resource. But if you're growing ginseng and someone comes on your, that's not poaching. I've told many, many people, get the word poaching out of your vocabulary. If you're growing ginseng, it's theft. And instead, okay, so poaching is something that you would call a game warden to deal with. Well, there's 300 game wardens in all of New York State, okay? But if someone robs from you, then you're going to call the local police. So really trying to get this mindset that people who are investing time, energy, and money into growing this, if they get robbed, they have legal recourse, and they should.
But now there's a dilemma for the guy that's growing it but doesn't want to say he's growing it because he wants to say it's wild. What's he going to do?
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. If someone indeed wants to sell this ginseng as wild, well, then they are going to have to obey all the regulations that apply to wild ginseng. However, if people would admit that they were growing it, they really, and again, depending on what state you're in, and New York State is pretty agricultural friendly in terms of ginseng. I mean, basically, if you want to grow ginseng in New York State, you can grow it as an agricultural crop. But if you want to grow ginseng in West Virginia or Kentucky, you have to follow all the regulations that are designed to protect wild ginseng, and you have to comply with those, which is pretty crazy. It makes the biggest barrier to ginseng being more widely grown are the regulations that are designed to protect it. That's the biggest barrier. People, what is the greatest threat to ginseng? I say the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the fact that ginseng is listed on CITES. I said that is the biggest threat to ginseng because there's no chance to develop a domestic market. Let's just say I'm going to Wisconsin next week. Let's just say while I'm in Wisconsin, I want to dig up some ginseng at one of my friend's farms that is this shade cloth. So I dig up this ginseng and I dig a couple of pounds of it and I want to take it back to New York with me. If I get caught crossing a state border with that ginseng without the documentation, without the paperwork, I can go to jail for 10 years. That's a violation of the Lacey Act. Okay, the Lacey Act was designed to prohibit smuggling across borders with the state. But unfortunately, ginseng is treated exactly the same. So we'll never have a domestic market until the government recognizes ginseng being commercially grown. The certification process, just to get ginseng certified, let's just say I grow ginseng here in New York, well, and I want to sell that to somebody in New Jersey. I would have to take those roots up to the DEC office in Stanford. I would have to have them weighed, counted, and certified by a DEC employee. I would then have to take the paperwork, and I have to provide that paperwork in order for that ginseng to go from New York to New Jersey. How can you develop a domestic market when you can't?
It sounds like you need like a ginseng lobbyist or something.
Well, we do. We really do. And that's part of what I'll be doing in Wisconsin next week, is I will be talking with the growers out there who are going broke because of the fact that trade relations with China. And it's like that's their only customer, okay? So if 90% of your market is going to China and China decides they're pissed off at America, which they are, then all of a sudden you've lost your market. If we had a domestic market, these farmers, these growers would have opportunities to sell their ginseng. But as long as ginseng is listed on CITES as a threatened and endangered plant, it's not going to happen. It's got to change.
We've been talking about ginseng and the medical value and all of that. What if I was completely ignorant and didn't know, which is possible, what are the big health benefits if I was going to be using ginseng?
Ginseng is probably what's the premier adaptogen. An adaptogen is a substance that helps your body deal with various types of stress. So ginseng would be generally recognized as something you would take for very non-specific purposes. In other words, if you got a cold or cancer, you would not specifically take ginseng, but you would take ginseng much in the way that you might take a multivitamin every day because, well, I don't know if I need these vitamins, but it can't hurt, might help. And so ginseng is prescribed as something that basically would keep you healthy, not particularly designed to cure anything. And most of the medical research that's been done on it has to do with how patients are coping with stress as a result of taking ginseng. The data that's out there, which is quite good, is in cancer patients who are undergoing chemotherapy and radiation treatment, taking ginseng, they're less debilitated. So it does seem to help them have a general sense of wellness and bearing. But it's not something that if I gave you a ginseng capsule right now and you took it, you would say, oh, I feel something. No, you probably wouldn't, which makes it unpopular because Americans are used to instant gratification.
Okay, and we are not advocating any medical stuff here. At the end of every interview, Tim insists that we ask this question. What are you most optimistic about today in ginseng world?
What I'm most optimistic about is the fact that there's a whole cadre of younger people who, in academia as well as in the real world, who are picking up the pieces and researching ginseng, and hopefully will get the regulations changed so that it can become a viable way for people to make some income off of their forest instead of just paying taxes on it every year.
Bob, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing us the baby ginsengs to look at.
Yeah.
We'll have to have everyone at home imagine them.
They will.
And we will be asking you again. I have a list. We're going to be seeing Bob more frequently.
Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent.
Works for me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank Sandra Linnell and Devin Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at columbiagreenmgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acre. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities